13 killed, 34 seriously injured, 190 casualties. These were the tragedies that occurred on the 1st of August in the year 2007. As the evening rush hour traffic crawls along its way through the I-35 West Mississippi River Bridge, an unexpected tragedy occurs on the bridge that had stood for over 50 years. This bridge is an essential crossing for many of the citizens in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The steel girder structure roughly stood at 1,907 feet. Moments before the tragedy struck, the bridge had become rather congested as 4 of the 8 lanes were closed due to the construction of the asphalt pavement. This caused the evening rush hour traffic to pile onto the limited space. The bridge falls in the blink of an eye. The vehicles plunge into the Mississippi River. The citizens truly only had borrowed time. This tragedy will have an impact of a lifetime. It is important to remember these incidents in order for engineers to fix design flaws in the structure and so that the same mistakes don't get repeated twice.
The collapse of the I-35 West Bridge in Minnesota was due to many different factors that added up over time. During the creation of the bridge, an engineering firm in charge of the design process suggested that the Minnesota Department of Transportation should use a 2-truss design over a 4-truss design for the bridge for economic reasons. The MMDOT and U.S. Federal Highway Administration also wanted to use A4441 steel over the more commonly used and stronger T1 steel, since the price per pound of it was cheaper and could be manufactured in larger quantities. These two things meant that although the cost to create the bridge was a lot cheaper, the structural integrity of the bridge would also be a lot lower compared to the T1 steel or 4-truss bridge. In the final design for the bridge, since weaker steel was being used, the gussets for the bridge had to be increased in size, although after this change was made, some of the gussets were made the old size, which would prove fatal in the following decades. Following the construction of the bridge, inches of concrete would be added to the bridge for renovations, which increased the dead load on the bridge by several thousand tons, increasing the stress on the bridge and gussets. Eventually, in 1991, the annual safety inspection score of the bridge suddenly dropped and stayed that low until one day during rush hour in 2007, the gussets snapped and the bridge collapsed.
So what are the responsibilities of civil engineers in their everyday profession? Civil engineers are responsible for serving the public and the environment. This is a failure of safety, property, and service. This case study is a prime example of the consequences that can occur should certain issues be ignored or not acknowledged. Engineers hold human life in their hands with their projects, and if they are done incorrectly or not upheld to a certain standard, that human life can be lost. The bridge was considered to be structurally deficient for over 15 years. In that time, some sort of change in order to fix that should have been created, but the only thing that they did was add to the problem by not considering the added weight of the concrete laid on top to cover any issues. The engineers assigned to this project failed to serve the public since a source of transportation is now gone, and they failed to keep the citizens safe, as 13 people were killed and many others were injured due to the bridge collapsing. Not to mention that $234 million were needed to replace this bridge, when the first one should have been enough. That's not all though, since the estimated loss to the economy was $60 million, along with $165.6 million in increased commuting expenses. This totals to a complete $459.6 million wasted on this bridge.
With the collapse of the I-35 West Bridge, we were able to see the clear influence that society has on engineers and the decisions that they make. Since the MMDOT wanted the bridge to be cheap, they forced the bridge to be created with weaker steel, which means that tweaks needed to be made to the original plans. These tweaks that now needed to be made were one of the biggest reasons that the bridge collapsed. Also following the I-35 West collapse, many other similar bridges were almost immediately closed in order to fix any issues that could lead to a similar disaster. The biggest reason that these other bridges were closed was in regard to public safety. For engineers, public safety is a top priority, and failing to prioritize this can result in the loss of human life and fines from the federal government. Although the loss of the 13 lives during the I-35 West collapse was a tragedy, engineers immediately went into action to avoid this happening again, making sure that no more lives would be lost.
Many things were learned from this event by a wide variety of people. Maintenance companies would learn not to cut corners when it comes to the safety of potentially thousands of people. Construction companies would learn to take rush hour traffic into account during equipment weight calculations. And city officials would learn that bridges built 50 plus years ago need more than a cursory glance at structural integrity. This doesn't only apply to the people in Minneapolis either. The collapse made national news, so those lessons were absorbed by the relevant people in other places before the event of another huge bridge collapse resulting in injuries and fatalities. While I wouldn't consider 2007 safety standards horribly outdated or unsafe, there can always be improvements made, especially over the course of a decade and a half. I have no doubt that there will be several more improvements made by the time 2037 rolls around. Unfortunately, as the phrase says, all safety regulations are written in blood. The people most severely affected by the collapse are the people who died, next to the people who knew them. Friends and family members likely had a long grieving process ahead of them, an incident investigation was launched, and new safety measures were put in place. The Twin Cities on the whole also grieved, with pieces being done about everyone who died, as well as the story being on the news for a very long time afterwards. But even random people were psychologically affected by the accident. My family was living in the area at the time, and while I was only 5, my mother remembers it quite well. Because the collapse made national news, she actually first found out because my aunt in Texas called to make sure we were safe. Afterwards, she called a bunch of people who might have been in the area to make sure they were safe. Thankfully, no one she called was on the bridge, although she did discover that 2 of them were on the bridge about 10 to 15 minutes beforehand. It was all about timing, honestly. She also told me that she felt really weird about driving under or over any bridges for a while afterwards, something she shared with several people she knows. I'm certain this was a pretty common experience at the time. If I think about what I might have done in the situation, my number one priority would definitely be safety. While I think that is definitely a very good priority to have, I know the exact importance with the benefit of hindsight. Reinforcing the existing structure with concrete probably seems like it was good enough at the time, especially since replacing any major parts of the bridge would likely have required a closure, and the I-35 is and was a very heavily used road. Additionally, any company wants to spend as little money as possible in order to make the maximum profit, so if the cheaper materials were considered good enough, they definitely would have used that instead of the better quality, more expensive option.
Many things can be taken from this case study. One thing is to take information given and to do something with it. With the safety inspections on this bridge, it was stated that the bridge was structurally deficient for 16 years. Even if renovations were originally done during the first few years of this, when it was noticed that the score didn't go up, more changes should have been made instead of keeping the bridge in a potentially unsafe condition. Looking into the future and stopping problems before they happen is also something that could have been taken from this collapse. With the weaker steel, it was known that the overall stress load that the bridge could take was now a lot lower. However, more and more weight was continuously added to the bridge until its eventual collapse. This is something that could have been avoided should the people who worked on the renovation plans taken this weaker stress load into consideration. One final thing that could be taken is that cheaper is not always better. This bridge is a prime example of this. Should the original T1 steel had been used, the collapse likely wouldn't have happened.
There were already 2 other bridges that saw the same fate as I-35 West that same year. Some structural engineering experts have even suggested that 8,000 US bridges were in need of remodeling. The moral of the story is that those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
Thank you for watching.